It is so good to see you here this morning. If we haven't had the opportunity to meet, my name is John. I'm the pastor here at the Parkwood Seventh-day Adventist Church. And you'll notice, for those of you that are our regular attendees, we have a little bit different format today, and that's for our seminar, Does God Exist? So obviously, we're posing the question, does God exist? And being that I'm a pastor and being that this is a church, you can probably guess which side of the question we have landed on. Nevertheless, I hope over the next few weeks to be able to give you some compelling reasons for why I believe God does indeed exist. Our format will be rather simple. We'll start off right about 11 each week with each of our 4 presentations. And since these are happening during what's normally our church time here for this congregation, after the presentation is over, there will be some additional program elements, and you're welcome to stay by and enjoy those. But if you have other things to get to, no offense taken, feel free to get up and take off or turn off the live stream after the program is done. While we could do way more than 4 presentations, we're going to limit it to just 4, and I have other presentations planned for the future. I'm going to be doing a series in the spring about if God is so good, and if God does exist, then why is the world filled with so much suffering and pain? So if you have questions, I'd invite you to stay after and chat with me, or if that's not a good option, you're welcome to text the number that we'll put here on the screen. It's the number 209-399-3500, and I'll do my best to interact with you and try to engage you in your questions on this big and important topic. So as we start, I just want to begin by saying I don't believe it's possible for me to prove to you with 100% certainty that God exists, just like I don't think it's possible for someone to prove the opposite of this. And you'll notice that in today's presentation, I'll be presenting more of not the argument for the Christian God per se, but for a supreme being of our universe. I hope to provide you some good reasons for God's existence, but I think if we're going to expect absolute 100% proof on this topic or on any topic, we're going to find ourselves with an unrealistic standard. I don't think it's possible for us to be 100% convinced necessarily of anything. For example, we can be pretty sure that we're not all living in some computer simulation, right? We're pretty confident that we're not all in some big computer simulation and that the world that appears real to us is just a simulation. So we're pretty confident that that's not the case, but we can't be 100% sure. But for a variety of reasons, we can be reasonably confident that that's not the case. In the same way, if you get onto an airplane, you can't be 100% absolutely certain that the plane will not crash. You can't be 100% certain that the plane is in good working order and that the pilot is going to do everything that they should do properly. But nevertheless, people regularly trust their lives into the pilot and to the plane's capable operation because they believe it's much more probable than not that they will be okay. So over the next few weeks, I'm going to be presenting a cumulative case for God's existence. And I believe that if we can reach the conclusion that it's more probable than not that God does indeed exist, then we can say that we believe God exists, even if we don't have all of our questions answered, and even if we still have more things that we would like to dig into. And finally, please keep in mind that these presentations, in order to present them to a wide audience, we can't get into every single detail, and the topic is very big. So I certainly don't claim to be an expert in philosophy or science or even religion. But at the very least, I hope to pique your curiosity to study into these topics more. Whether you've been a long-time Christian or a long-time skeptic, I think this is a good topic for us to be discussing. So, having gotten that introduction out of the way, let's dive into our topic for today, which is the origin of our universe. Throughout time, people have looked out at our world and our universe and wondered, how did this all come to be? In ancient Greeks, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, they believed that matter was uncreated and eternal. In their view, God may have arranged the present world, but he certainly didn't create it. Now, ancient Jewish thought had a different approach to the question of the universe because they taught that the universe and all the matter within it had a definite beginning, and that God was the creator forming everything out of nothing. You can see Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So this phrase, heavens and earth, since the Hebrews had no word for universe, is taken to be in reference to the creation of the universe out of nothing by God at a definite point in history. Now, in the 12th century, there was a Muslim philosopher named Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. He was from Iran, and he was concerned that the philosophers of his day were being influenced by Greek philosophy, believing that the universe had always existed. And he believed that the universe had a beginning. So he wrote a book called The Incoherence of Philosophers. And he did it because he was trying to push back against this Greek idea that the universe was eternal. He introduced his argument by saying the following. He said this: every being which begins has a cause for its beginning. Now the world is a being which begins, therefore it possesses a cause for its beginning. Now, modern philosopher William Lane Craig has taken this argument and put it into some more modern language, and we can see what he's called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And it goes as follows. 1, everything which begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, as simple as this argument is, it's actually quite deep and quite profound. And if the first 2 premises of the argument are true, then the conclusion will logically follow. In fact, as we discussed earlier, you don't have to have 100% certainty of the premises to accept the conclusion. We just have to believe that the premises are more plausibly true than their denial to accept that the conclusion is true. So let's analyze it one point at a time. First, it says everything which begins to exist has a cause. Now, this seems more obviously true than its denial. To believe that anything can just pop into existence uncaused, that's a stretch of the imagination, isn't it? I mean, not even if you go to a magic show do they try to get you to believe that things come into being uncaused. In a magic show, if a tiger appears on a stage suddenly or in a cage suddenly, at least you've got the magicians who are supposedly causing this alleged miracle. So if magic were real, you wouldn't even have things coming into being without a cause. There still would be a cause, an agent doing the causing. And if things could pop randomly into existence uncaused from nothing, then it would make you wonder why just anything and everything doesn't come into existence this way. I mean, if it did happen this way, can you imagine how hard it would be to sleep at night? Fearing that a baby grand piano or a blue whale or perhaps the Starship Enterprise is going to pop into being uncaused right above your bed and come crashing down upon you. And this to us is absurd because our everyday observation of the universe and the world tells us that things don't come into being from nothing without a cause. But that doesn't stop people like atheist philosopher Quentin Smith, who at least at one point during his career said the following. He said, quote, "The most reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing." This is a position that you could hold, but I don't find it to be very persuasive. Now, others have suggested that while it's true that things within the universe must have a cause to come into being, they've said the universe itself does not need a cause. But what gives the universe an exception to the principle of causality? As Arthur Schopenhauer once said, the causal principle is not something that you can just dismiss like a cab when you've arrived at your desired destination. Now, some have sought to avoid the need for a cause of all things by pointing to quantum mechanics or quantum physics, which deals with atoms and the particles that make up atoms, extremely small things. And it's said that at this level, that things can happen strangely and even spontaneously without a cause. I'd planned to go into more detail, but it was going to get too deep into the weeds if I did. Let me just summarize by saying that not all scientists agree that events are uncaused even at the subatomic level. There are at least 10 different interpretations of quantum mechanics, any of which could be correct, and a number of those do involve cause and effect. It also should be noted that even on the traditional interpretation of quantum mechanics, particles don't come into being out of nothing. The vacuum of space, which we think of as being totally empty, actually has energy in it and has been described by people like Bernolf Konitscheider as having, quote, rich physical structure. So this alleged exception to the first premise of the argument doesn't seem to pose an issue. And the first premise could simply be reworded, and we could avoid this question altogether. So in my estimation, Ghazali's first premise is really solid. And our reason and our common everyday experience confirm the truth of the premise that everything which begins to exist must have a cause. But one objection that is sometimes raised to this, people hear this argument and they say, aha, but what or who then caused God? But you'll notice that premise 1 doesn't claim that everything has a cause, but rather everything which begins to exist must have a cause. And anything which has existed eternally would therefore be uncaused, not having a beginning. And even like the atheist philosopher Daniel Dennett himself recognizes that things like abstract objects, which he says are, quote, outside of time, is nothing with an initiation or origin of need of explanation. He does say this, what is needing an explanation is the concrete universe itself. Furthermore, atheists have historically argued throughout the centuries that the universe is beginningless and without cause. And so there's really no special pleading here to suggest that God himself is the same way. And as Dennett admitted, what really needs an explanation is the cause of the universe. So the first premise is more plausibly true than its denial. Everything which begins to exist must have a cause. But what about the second premise? The universe began to exist. Is this true? There are those, such as Bertrand Russell, the famous philosopher and atheist, who once said, the universe is just there, and that's all. He accepted the idea that the universe has always existed, and he believed that it was uncaused and uncreated. But this isn't an idea that would satisfy al-Ghazali. And even though he lacked scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe, he had strong philosophical reasons for believing that the universe had a beginning. He argued that it was impossible for there to be an actually infinite number of things. And while we can imagine this concept, and mathematicians regularly do, when you try to apply it to our reality, it becomes absurd. One type of actual infinite that Ghazali wrote about was an infinite regress of events. In other words, he argued that it was impossible for the past series of causes to go all the way back for infinity, just like you couldn't have a long stretch of dominoes from infinity on to this present point. You can imagine it, but in reality, it's not possible. So as Ghazali applied the concept of an actual infinity in our world, he demonstrated just how impossible it was. But that's exactly what you would have if the universe had been past eternal. Perhaps the best modern example of an actual infinite and its impossibility was posed by the German mathematician David Hilbert. He imagined a hotel. You can picture a hotel in your mind? Now picture this hotel has an infinite number of rooms, and every single room in the infinite hotel is full. There'd be a sign outside that would say, no vacancies. But now imagine that one guest, a new guest, shows up to the hotel, and the manager says, we're full, but we can accommodate you. And so he proceeds to move the person in room 1 to room 2. The person in room 2 simultaneously goes to room 3, and the person in room 3 simultaneously goes to room 4, and so on out to infinity. And since there's no end to infinity, the manager is able to accommodate one more guest at his infinitely full hotel. But it gets even stranger, because Hilbert realized you could do this not with just one person, but you could add an infinite number of additional people to this infinitely full hotel. So imagine an infinite number of people show up at the full hotel. The manager says, we're full, but I think I can work something out. And so he moves each person in every room to the room number that's exactly double theirs. The person in room 1 would move to room 2. The person in room 2 would move to room 4. The person in room 3 would move to room 6, and so on. And since the double of any number is an even number, this leaves an infinite number of odd numbers available. Now, the manager can accommodate all the new guests. And what's even crazier is he could do this an infinite number of times. While we can sort of wrap our minds around it as a thought experiment, in the real world, Hilbert's hotel is totally impossible. That's because actual infinities can't exist in our world, and an infinite chain of cause and effect events stretching back into eternity is not possible. He also realized that it was impossible in the same way that a person could not count down to 0 from negative infinity. Because you could never arrive at the present number. For example, if it took 1 second to count one number and a person started counting down from negative infinity, it would take an infinite number of seconds to arrive at 0. And an infinite number of seconds is an infinite amount of time. And so you could never arrive at the present moment. But yet here we are. And so through studying the concept of an actual infinite and applying it to the world, Ghazali realized it just is not possible. Our universe, therefore, from philosophical reasons, could not have existed past eternally. Now, there are also scientific reasons why this could not have been the case as well. The second law of thermodynamics states that processes taking place in a closed system tend towards a state of equilibrium. For example, if I were to light a match up here on the stage and I blew it out, what would happen to the smoke? It would, maybe some of it rise, some of it spread out. I could smell the smoke here for a couple of moments, and then it would spread out through this room, and after 10 minutes or so, none of us would smell anything because it would be so evenly distributed throughout the air in our room. Similarly, our universe is filled with a limited amount of energy. Most obviously, to our eyes, it's concentrated in things like stars and galaxies. But over time, this energy is being used up and it's being spread out across our universe. And if given enough time, if the universe was eternal, all of the energy will be spread out. And if the universe has always existed, then we shouldn't be seeing any light, any energy, any heat. Our universe should already have experienced what scientists call the heat death of the universe, because that's what would happen on its own to the universe if it had existed forever. Now, some have tried to get around this suggestion, or this idea, by suggesting that perhaps there are multiple universes and that perhaps energy is being fed into our universe from another universe. And while this is a creative suggestion, it only pushes the problem back a step further. Because if the multiverse has existed forever, then the multiverse should have run out of usable, visible energy and reached a state of equilibrium. And yet, here we are. You can see for yourselves, there's light, there's heat, especially in Modesto. We know this to be very true. But this wouldn't be possible if the universe had always existed. So the second law of thermodynamics illustrates and strongly points to a universe that had a beginning. Now, in the last century, there have been some great strides made in discovering the origins of our universe, learning more about it. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. And at the time, he believed that the universe was static. It was not moving, not contracting, not expanding. But as brilliant scientists began to apply his equations, they began to see a different picture. In fact, there was a man in 1922, he was a Russian physicist named Alexander Friedmann, and he showed that Einstein's equations were compatible with a universe that was expanding. A few years later, in 1927, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian astrophysicist, concluded that the universe was expanding by using Albert Einstein's equations and observations from astronomy. And then, in 1929, we have a man named Edwin Hubble. You're probably familiar with the Hubble telescope, named after him. As he was looking out at different points in our universe, he noticed that the light from distant galaxies appeared redder than it should. And this was called redshift, which is today recognized as a phenomena that occurs because our universe is expanding. The shifting light appearance was much like how the sound from a motorcycle changes as it goes past you. Now, if you're riding the motorcycle, the sound stays the same. But from the what's that? Oh, thank you. Yeah. It probably wasn't a Harley. It was a different kind of motorcycle. Nevertheless, that's the principle that's being illustrated here. Instead of with sound, with the visible appearance of light. In fact, these observations changed Einstein's mind. And he believed, after Edwin Hubble's evidence, that the universe was indeed expanding. In fact, scientists realize that the universe is expanding in all directions. And when you go back in time, tracing the expansion backwards, the universe gets smaller and smaller, and eventually you get to a single point, a beginning of the universe in the finite past. And it should be noted that scientific models and data indicate our universe is expanding not into previously empty space, but that space itself is expanding. In fact, many scientists today believe that the universe is accelerating in its expansion rate. Now, ever since the Standard Model was proposed in the 1920s, scientists have proposed scores of different alternate models, ones that don't have an absolute beginning to the universe, but these have repeatedly shown themselves over time to be unworkable. The only viable non-standard models are the ones that have a definite beginning. And even the late great physicist Stephen Hawking, who proposed his own model for the universe, had a model which had a definite point, a beginning. In 2003, Arvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to develop a mathematical proof which showed that any universe which has been expanding on average must have a definite, cannot be infinite, but have a space-time boundary. And it should be added that this is true. Their proof showed it was true even in inflationary multiverse scenarios. So notice the quote here by Alexander Vilenkin. Powerful statement. It is said, he said, that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. So let's review what we've discussed so far. And if it's too much for your brain, I'm sorry. And if it's not enough for your brain, I'm sorry also. Happy to chat afterwards. But let's review what we've seen so far. We've discussed the first premise, which says everything which begins to exist must have a cause. And we found that reason, observation, and just everyday experience demonstrate this truth. And then we discussed the second premise, which says that the universe began to exist. And we backed this up by sharing three different independent arguments for this. One was philosophical, based on the impossibility of an actual infinite in our world, specifically an infinite regress of cause and effect events into the past. And secondly, we saw that the second law of thermodynamics makes it impossible for our universe to have existed eternally in the past. And finally, we saw from modern observational cosmology that science is confirming that the universe had indeed a beginning. But it should be noted that while the truth of the second premise appreciates, while it's nice to have this observational cosmology, it's not dependent upon that. There are other independent arguments that illustrate the universe had a beginning. These observations of the last decade are more like, or a century, are more like the icing on the cake. Okay, so then if those two premises show themselves to be true, and I think that they do, we then get to the logical conclusion that the universe has a cause. And then the question, well, what caused the universe? You could take the position that Daniel Dennett, atheist philosopher, did in his book, Breaking the Spell, when he suggested that the universe may simply have caused itself. He wrote, what does need its origin explained is the concrete universe itself. As Hume long ago asked, why not stop at the material world? It does perform a version of the ultimate bootstrapping trick. It creates itself ex nihilo, out of nothing. Or at any rate, something that is well nigh indistinguishable from nothing at all. While this is a creative and entertaining solution, it's not very compelling. It would make us wonder why just anything and everything couldn't cause itself to come into existence. You can imagine a man who's pulled over by the policeman, and the policeman looks in the window and the guy has a beer in his hand and it's open. Bad news, right? So the man would say, honestly, officer, I have no idea where this came from. It probably just caused itself to come into existence right in my hand. What bad luck I've had, officer. How compelling would that be? It's not compelling at all because we know the idea of something causing itself to come into existence is absurd, even for universes. So what then could explain the universe? For something to cause the beginning of all space, time, matter, that cause itself must logically be outside of space, time, and matter. And it must be enormously powerful and also logically personal. Now, why would we say that this cause must be personal? Well, first of all, there are a couple of ways to talk about causes. We can think about causes in terms of initial conditions through scientific laws and principles, or we can think about causes in terms of agents and their will. For example, if you're riding along with your friend in the car and you're going fast, and you ask your friend, hey, why are we going so fast? Your friend could turn to you and say, well, there's a pedal on my side of the car. It's called the accelerator. It controls the flow rate of fuel into the combustion chamber. And given that a downward force has been exerted onto the pedal by my foot, more fuel has been added to the combustion chamber, thus causing the pistons to fire faster, converting that energy into torque on to the drive shaft, onto our wheels, and thus exerting a force on the road. They could say that, right? Or they could just say, I don't want to be late. And both explanations of causality, in this case, would be fully legitimate. One is a scientific cause, the other is a personal cause. And when you're looking for an explanation to the beginning of all space, time, matter, energy, you're going to find yourself lacking if you look for it in a way that involves a material cause. Rather, a personal cause seems more likely. And so, since the time and matter began at the start of the universe, we're looking for an answer which lies outside of time and matter. And the only entities that are things like minds or abstract objects like numbers. And since abstract objects like numbers can't cause anything, except for maybe a headache in math class, the only other option for us is some kind of personal mind, some personal agent. And finally, the reason why a personal agent seems most likely is because it's the best way to explain how you can get how a timeless cause, a cause that has existed timelessly or eternally, could produce an effect which is not timeless, like the beginning of our universe. For example, if we say that the cause of water freezing is temperature below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and if that cause has always been powerful and also personal. And this is a very simple description of what we commonly call today God. So based on the evidence, the Kalam Cosmological Argument provides a sound foundation for rational belief in God's existence. This concludes the first of our 4 presentations. As you recall, there are 4 together, and they present a cumulative case. Now, if you have questions that you'd like to discuss, I'd invite you to stick around if you have the time after the rest of the program, or you can catch me next week, or you can text me at 209-399-3500. And if you'd like to study further into this particular argument I presented today, there are 2 books I'd recommend. One is more basic and the other is more complex. The more basic book is called On Guard, and it's by Dr. William Lane Craig. And the more complex book is called Reasonable Faith, also by the same author, for whom I am deeply indebted for the content of today's presentation. Now, next week, we're going to totally switch gears. If this was totally above your head and outside of what you're used to, that's all right. Next week, instead of looking out into the universe, we're going to have an argument for God's existence based on looking into our hearts. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.